Forget the scandals, intrigues, and sinister secrets we spoke of earlier. It is time to uncover another, no less shocking side of the Golden Age. In a world ruled by the sharks of the film business, cynical producers, and egocentric divas, there were people whose kindness bordered on madness. These were actors with crystal souls who gave their last dollars to strangers, supported entire clans of freeloaders for years, and allowed studios to squeeze every last drop from them just to avoid hurting anyone's feelings. Their gentleness was mistaken for weakness, their generosity for foolishness, and their willingness to sacrifice themselves became a private hell. We're used to thinking of Hollywood as a nest of vipers, but today we will speak of those who were too pure for such a dirty place and who paid an unbearable price for their goodness. But before we move on to our first star, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment. Enjoy the show.
Boris Karloff is a name that millions of viewers associate with icy terror, sleepless nights, and the image of the most famous monster in film history. His hollow cheeks, heavy gait, and haunting stare in Frankenstein created a horror canon that would endure for decades. Yet the real story of William Henry Pratt, the actor's true name, is not a chronicle of fear, but a tragic and inspiring tale of a man who was simply too kind for Hollywood. Boris Karloff was a shockingly decent old-school gentleman whose softness and humility were shamelessly exploited by everyone, from greedy studio moguls to random passers-by. In an industry where elbows and fangs were the tools of survival, Karloff survived through apologies and endless patience, becoming a lifelong hostage to his own saintliness. His road to fame was paved with hardship, and perhaps that was why he valued every person he met along the way. When success came crashing down on him after Frankenstein, Universal Studios did not see a great actor, but a perfect, compliant, money-making machine. Karloff possessed astonishing, almost superhuman endurance, and studio bosses exploited it with sadistic elegance. The monster's makeup took 4 to 5 hours to apply every single day. It was an ordeal. Heavy lead inserts in his boots, layers of caustic collodion on his face that tightened his skin until he could barely breathe, and a costume that weighed dozens of kilograms. Karloff never complained. He saw how exhausted the crew was and feared that his objections might delay ordinary workers and cost them an extra hour of sleep. The studio knew this and forced him to work 16 to 18 hours a day in this hell. In the end, the weight of the costume and shoes permanently damaged his spine. He underwent several surgeries and finished his life in a wheelchair. Yet, until his final days, he spoke of his tormentors, the producers, with unwavering respect. Karloff's kindness was so contagious that on set he was known simply as Dear Boris. While other stars demanded private limousines and gourmet delicacies, Karloff would share lunch with a dock worker or spend his break helping a lighting technician move heavy equipment. He was the only star of his stature who genuinely cared about the rights of the little people in cinema. It was precisely his kindness and fierce sense of justice that led him to become one of the founders of the Screen Actors Guild. He risked his career by standing up to the all-powerful studios, not for himself, but to protect extras and young actors from the same exploitation he endured. Away from the cameras, his generosity was truly staggering and often crossed the line into self-sacrifice. His Hollywood home was constantly occupied by dubious characters, distant relatives, unrecognized poets, and failed actors. Everyone knew that Boris could not say no. He supported dozens of people, paid for their medical care and for their children's education, often finding himself with empty pockets at the end of the month. At the same time, he was pathologically modest. Karloff anonymously donated enormous sums to orphanages and hospitals, forbidding his agents from using this for publicity. His favorite time of year was Christmas. Every year this terrifying monster put on a Santa Claus costume, loaded his car with gifts bought with his own money, and secretly visited children's hospitals. He sat by the beds of gravely ill children, told them stories, and gave them the warmth Hollywood had tried so hard to burn out of him. Karloff was unstoppable in his desire to be useful. Even when age and illness made every step painful, he continued to accept any job offered him. And once again, this was exploited, now by directors of low-budget films. They knew that if the name Karloff appeared in the credits, audiences would come. Boris was cast in dubious projects, made to freeze in the cold or wait for hours between takes in dusty sound stages. He agreed because he was afraid of letting down those who depended on him, and because he still had to support those who had grown accustomed to living at his expense. He died in 1969, leaving behind not only great roles, but the memory of a man who was too pure for the dream factory. Boris Karloff remains one of the greatest paradoxes of classic cinema, a man who spent his life frightening audiences on screen so he could comfort them in reality, and who allowed the industry to take all his health and strength without uttering a single word of reproach.
Carole Lombard. Carole Lombard entered history as the brightest star of screwball comedy and a woman of almost otherworldly beauty. Yet her true greatness lay elsewhere. She was perhaps the most profoundly human being of the entire Golden Age. In an era when stardom erected an impenetrable wall of limousines and bodyguards between actors and reality, Lombard dismantled that wall piece by piece. She was the highest-paid actress of her time, yet her relationship with money and fame was shockingly selfless. Carole possessed a soul of such magnitude that everyone took advantage of her kindness without hesitation, from studio bosses to random strangers who saw in her not a screen goddess, but a steady shoulder to lean on. She was a saint of comedy, a woman whose empathy became her life's mission, and Hollywood gladly consumed this resource, giving nothing in return. The Lombard phenomenon lay in her absolute, almost unsettling lack of snobbery. In an industry where extras were treated as background noise, Carole knew every person on set by name. Her kindness was active and personal. She became the first major star to openly clash with studio executives not over her own salary, but over working conditions for the crew. If the set was too cold or lunches arrived late, Lombard turned into a furious force of nature, defending the rights of those who could not defend themselves. Producers quickly realized that Carole's kindness was also their leverage. Knowing she could not bear the thought of ordinary people losing their jobs, they manipulated her with impossible schedules and punishing projects. Carole, if you don't agree to this role right now, the picture will be shut down and hundreds of carpenters and makeup artists won't be able to feed their families at Christmas. And Lombard, even when she was utterly exhausted, would agree. She worked 16-hour days simply to save other people's paychecks. Her goodness became an insurance policy against production failures. She understood this perfectly, yet she could not act otherwise. Away from the cameras, her generosity was legendary and often bordered on recklessness. During the Great Depression, Carole Lombard became the first movie star to publicly declare that she was happy to pay enormous taxes because she believed in social justice. While her peers hired lawyers to hide their income offshore, she openly said, "I earned this money in this country, and I want it to go toward building schools and hospitals." That admission turned her into a magnet for endless pleas. Thousands of strangers wrote to her, and Carole, ignoring her lawyer's advice, often read the letters herself and wrote checks in response. Her home with Clark Gable was constantly occupied by friends who lived at her expense for years. She knew they were driven by self-interest, but her heart was too soft to throw them out. She believed it was her duty to share everything she had, and Hollywood accepted this offering eagerly, turning her life into a never-ending act of charity. The political machinery of the United States also recognized Lombard as an ideal instrument. When World War II began, her patriotism and willingness to help were exploited to the fullest. Carole became the first movie star to throw herself into volunteer work with a fervor that frightened those closest to her. She did not have to do it. She could have simply donated money, but Carole wanted to be on the front lines. The government capitalized on her immense popularity, sending her on exhausting war bond tours. She worked herself to the brink, signing autographs until her hands trembled, speaking personally with thousands of people, persuading them to invest in victory. The tragic end of her life in January 1942 was a direct result of her inability to refuse. Not wanting to be late for yet another fundraising engagement, not wanting to let down the organizers who depended on her presence, Carole insisted on flying in bad weather. The plane crashed into Table Rock Mountain, and Lombard died at the height of her beauty and her kindness. She was a woman who quite literally gave her life for others, a victim of her own decency and her inability to say no. Carole Lombard remains in memory as a goddess who willingly descended from Olympus to heal the wounds of ordinary people. Her story is a bitter reminder of how dangerous it can be to be too kind in a world that has learned only how to consume the light of others. She was the soul of a nation, a fire that allowed everyone around her to warm themselves, until she herself was reduced to ashes. James Stewart was not merely a great actor. He was the living embodiment of the American conscience. On screen, he often portrayed an ordinary man standing up for justice against a vast, corrupt machine. But in real life, his own story was an even more striking example of integrity and self-sacrifice. His kindness was never loud or performative. It was a quiet, deeply rooted decency that compelled him, in any situation, to place the needs of others above his own. Yet in the cynical world of the dream factory, such purity of spirit inevitably turned a man into something to be used. James Stewart was shockingly kind, and everyone took advantage of it. Film studios, government institutions, and countless acquaintances who saw in his integrity not a virtue, but a weakness they could exploit. Perhaps the clearest demonstration of his extraordinary goodness was his military service. When the Second World War broke out, Stewart was at the very peak of his career, having just won an Academy Award for The Philadelphia Story. MGM, which had invested millions in him, was prepared to do anything to keep its most valuable asset away from the front lines. He was offered comfortable desk jobs at headquarters or roles in propaganda films far from danger. But Stewart, guided by an uncompromising sense of duty, believed he had no right to hide behind the backs of ordinary young men. His modesty and moral resolve were so strong that he fought the bureaucratic machine itself to be sent into combat. He succeeded, becoming a bomber pilot and flying 20 extremely dangerous missions over enemy territory. The government and military authorities later exploited his image as the perfect hero without mercy. After the war, he was pushed into endless promotional campaigns for the armed forces, fully aware that Jimmy was too polite and too devoted to duty to refuse. He never complained of exhaustion, even though the war left deep scars on his soul, which he concealed behind a gentle smile. In professional circles, Stewart was a producer's dream in the bleakest sense of the phrase. Every major player in Hollywood took advantage of his reliability. He was known for never causing scandals over pay, living conditions on set, or the quality of a script. If a director asked him to do 20 more takes in freezing water or at a dangerous height, Stewart complied without a single word of protest, determined not to upset the crew or disrupt the schedule. Colleagues recalled that Jimmy often took the blame for other people's mistakes on set, shielding junior staff from being fired. Studio bosses understood that Stewart could be persuaded into almost any project simply by appealing to his loyalty and sense of friendship. For years, he appeared in films he disliked solely because he had promised an old acquaintance to help carry a troubled production. His kindness became his prison. He could not say no if he felt that the well-being of others depended on him. Stewart's personal life was also a landscape of relentless exploitation of his generosity. His home was open to old friends and acquaintances, many of whom lived at his expense for years, taking advantage of his inability to show even the most blatant freeloaders the door. He donated enormous sums to charity, supporting funds for veterans and orphans, doing so quietly that the full extent of his giving became known only decades later. Jimmy Stewart genuinely believed that his success was not his own achievement, but an advance he was obligated to repay to the world every single day. This philosophy made him easy prey for manipulators of every kind. He lived a long life as a standard of nobility, yet behind that image stood a man who consciously allowed the world to use him, convinced that this was the highest meaning of existence. He was a knight without fear or reproach, who believed in human goodness to his very last breath, even as others shamelessly stole his time, his strength, and his peace of mind.
Marilyn Monroe. Marilyn Monroe is a name that became synonymous with absolute femininity and tragic beauty. Yet behind that dazzling facade lived a woman whose kindness was so immense it bordered on pathological self-erasure. In a world that saw her only as a sexual trophy or a profitable commodity, Marilyn remained a startlingly pure and vulnerable child, aching to give warmth to everyone she met. Her kindness was not a strategy, it was her essence, her way of communicating with a world she believed to be far kinder than it truly was. Everyone exploited this trait without mercy, from casual acquaintances and freeloaders to powerful intellectuals, politicians, and studio bosses. Marilyn Monroe was Hollywood's holy sinner, a woman who gave herself away piece by piece until nothing remained but a legend. Marilyn's kindness revealed itself in small, intimate gestures that the press of the time rarely noticed. She felt a deep instinctive compassion for those who, like her, once stood at the bottom of the social ladder. Entire studio crews benefited from her generosity. She could spend hours listening to a makeup artist's complaints about family troubles, gift expensive French perfume to wardrobe assistants, or pay school tuition for her driver's children. She was one of the very few stars of her stature who sincerely and actively fought prejudice. In an era of rigid segregation, Marilyn used her influence to help Ella Fitzgerald perform at the prestigious Mocambo Club, promising the owner that she would sit in the front row every single night. This was kindness in action. She did not merely sympathize, she was willing to risk her status for others. Yet those around her saw this softness only as weakness. Producers and agents manipulated her deep insecurity, making her feel that she owed everything to the studio, squeezing the last reserves of strength from her during grueling shoots even when she was physically and emotionally exhausted. Even more sinister was the way Marilyn's kindness was exploited in her private life. Her desperate need to be needed and loved made her the perfect prey for emotional scavengers. Psychoanalysts, husbands, and so-called friends lived off her for years, not only financially but emotionally as well. She allowed people in her inner circle to control her income, make decisions on her behalf, and even dictate how she should feel.
Marilyn was reckless in her desire to help. She could spend an entire night comforting a distressed friend, even if she was due on set at 5 the next morning. She felt other people's pain more sharply than her own, and that empathy was exploited by those who wanted to bask in the glow of her fame. Intellectuals like Arthur Miller sought pure sincerity in her, yet often crushed her personality under their lofty standards, making her feel inadequate and deepening her need to earn love through ever-new acts of kindness. The tragedy of Marilyn Monroe was that she was simply too kind for an industry that feeds on human weakness. Her sincerity was mistaken for stupidity, her generosity for calculated self-promotion. She gave away her last strength trying to save others from their demons, while her own demons devoured her from within. Hollywood used her light until the bulb burned out, and when she was left alone in her emptiness, none of those she had so devotedly saved were there beside her. Marilyn did not die from an excess of fame, but from an excess of kindness the world was unable to digest. She was an angel lost in a hall of mirrors, where everyone saw only their own reflection in her, and no one wanted to look into her heart, which remained open until its very last beat for anyone who came asking for help.
Bela Lugosi, whose name is forever etched into film history as the embodiment of Count Dracula himself, was in reality the complete opposite of his screen persona. While audiences trembled at his icy gaze and ominous whisper, Lugosi was a man of almost childlike innocence and a scale of kindness that Hollywood considered pathological. His tragedy lay in the fact that he brought with him from Europe a code of honor and hospitality utterly alien to the cynical dream factory. Bela Lugosi was shockingly kind, and everyone exploited this trait without exception, from crowds of Hungarian immigrants to Hollywood producers who saw his decency as an easy way to save money on a living legend. On screen, he was the king of darkness. In life, he was the patron saint of all lost souls, who ultimately found himself completely alone in his empty castle. Lugosi's kindness was deeply rooted in his origins. As soon as he became a star of the first magnitude after the release of Dracula in 1931, his Los Angeles home turned into an unofficial consulate and free cafeteria for Hungarians fleeing to America. Lugosi felt immense compassion for his countrymen. Hundreds of people took advantage of his generosity. He did not merely feed and shelter casual acquaintances, he considered it his duty to find work for every Hungarian actor or technician who arrived in Hollywood. He spent enormous sums paying for flights, housing, and even clothing for people he had never met before. These dependents lived in his mansion for years, using his connections and his money, while Bela, driven by a powerful sense of solidarity, never asked for anything in return. He was uncontrollable in his desire to help. Even when his own fees began to shrink rapidly, he continued to write checks to charities, convinced that success was given to him only so that he could share it with others. Yet the most sinister exploitation of Bela Lugosi's kindness came from the film industry itself. Studio executives quickly realized that Bela was a gentleman of the old school, incapable of bargaining, and convinced that discussing money was beneath his dignity. His integrity was abused through contracts that were openly predatory. Knowing that Bela was burdened by enormous expenses for his protégés and charitable causes, they offered him humiliatingly low salaries for roles that demanded tremendous effort. Bela accepted these terms without protest, afraid of appearing ungrateful or petty. Later, when the fashion for classic horror faded, his kindness and desperation were exploited by directors of low-budget films such as Ed Wood. Lugosi, advanced in age and suffering from illness, agreed to appear in absurd productions solely because he did not want to disappoint people who called themselves his friends. He allowed his name to be used to promote dubious projects just so the crew could earn a living, often sacrificing his own dignity in the process. The tragic end of Bela Lugosi became a monument to his unclaimed kindness. The people he had fed for decades vanished the moment his money ran out. His endless generosity led him to complete financial and emotional ruin. In the final years of his life, he was left alone in a small apartment, surrounded by photographs of former greatness, yet without a trace of bitterness in his heart. He continued to believe in people even as they shamelessly drained his time and strength. Lugosi was too noble for a world where sincerity is treated as small change. He died buried in his Dracula costume, the only thing Hollywood left him as an inheritance. But those few who knew him personally remembered not the vampire's fangs, but the warm hands of a man who gave his entire heart to the world, leaving not a single drop for himself.
Ingrid Bergman. Ingrid Bergman entered Hollywood history as the face of Casablanca and the embodiment of crystalline purity. Yet behind her radiant smile and aristocratic grace lived a woman whose kindness was so raw and elemental that it simply did not fit within the artificial framework of the dream factory. Ingrid possessed a rare gift. She saw only the best in people and was willing to sacrifice herself for that belief. Her kindness was not calculated. It was instinctive, untamed, and impossible to control. In an industry where every step was choreographed by publicists, Bergman remained frighteningly sincere, and everyone took advantage of that sincerity, from envious colleagues to entire nations that first lifted her onto a pedestal and then publicly crucified her for her inability to lie. She was an angel who refused to play by the rules of demons, and she paid for her kindness with years of exile. On set, Ingrid's kindness was legendary. She was one of the few top-tier stars who categorically refused any special privileges. Crew members and extras benefited most from this. Ingrid would stand for hours in pouring rain or cutting wind if she saw that the lighting crew had not yet finished setting up. She never complained about exhaustion, afraid that her protest might cost someone from the junior staff their job. Producers exploited this trait without shame. Knowing that threats would never work on Bergman, they appealed to her compassion. They told her the film's budget was running out and that only her self-sacrifice could save the production from collapse. And Ingrid worked until she fainted, gave up her rightful days off, all to avoid letting the team down. She believed filmmaking was a collective effort and allowed the industry to drain her completely, seeing it as her duty to her colleagues. Off-screen, her faith in people often took forms Hollywood considered madness. She was astonishingly generous to strangers. Ingrid could invite a fan with no money for lodging into her home, or hand over every last bill in her wallet to a passerby with a sad story. Manipulators of every kind exploited this naivety. There were always people around her who basked in the glow of her fame and lived off her resources. The loudest scandal of her life, her departure with Roberto Rossellini, was driven not only by passion but by her boundless kindness and her desire to save a brilliant artist in whom she saw a suffering soul. The entire world, including the United States Senate, turned against her, accusing her of immorality, but Ingrid simply did not know how to pretend. She was too honest to live a double life and too kind to abandon someone who, as she believed, truly needed her. Ingrid Bergman spent years in exile, vilified by the very people she had inspired for so long with her performances. Yet even this did not harden her. Her kindness was unsinkable. She continued to help those who had betrayed her, convinced that people act cruelly only out of fear or pain. She was a woman who could forgive the unforgivable, and that gift was exploited until the very end.
Hollywood eventually welcomed her back when it realized that without her light, the screen had grown too dim, but Ingrid already knew the price of that love. She remains in history as a woman who carried her holiness through the hell of public contempt, proving that true kindness is not weakness, but the highest form of courage reserved for those willing to lose everything in order not to lose themselves.
Gary Cooper was the embodiment of unshakable dignity and quiet masculine strength. On screen, he was the taciturn sheriff, soldier, or working man who could decide the fate of entire worlds with a few words and a precise action. In real life, however, behind this steel facade lived a man of shockingly gentle, almost painful softness. Cooper possessed a soul so decent and free of malice that predatory Hollywood regarded him as a wholly innocent. He was a man of his word and his honor, and absolutely everyone exploited his kindness without shame, from small-time con artists posing as friends to massive film studios that saw his reliability as a way to save millions of dollars. Gary Cooper was a knight without fear or reproach, who believed to the very end that kindness was humanity's natural state, even as the world around him proved otherwise. Cooper's kindness on set was legendary. Unlike many of his fellow stars, he never demanded special treatment or threw tantrums over trivialities. Crew members and supporting actors often benefited from his generosity. Gary was known to quietly ask a director to give more screen time to an unlucky colleague or to anonymously supplement the pay of background actors out of his own pocket. Paramount producers exploited this trait for years. Knowing that Cooper hated conflict and dreaded hurting anyone, they bound him to punish in contracts and forced him into films that held no interest for him. They would tell him, "Gary, you are the face of the studio. If you refuse this script, hundreds of people will lose their jobs." And the steel-like Cooper, unwilling to become the cause of someone else's hardship, obediently walked onto the soundstage, working 18-hour days without a single word of protest. Studio executives called him the most convenient actor, which, in Hollywood language, meant a man whose integrity could be milked endlessly. Away from the cameras, Cooper's generosity bordered on self-sacrifice. He was a man incapable of closing the door on anyone who asked for help. Hundreds of friends and relatives took advantage of this, many of them living at his expense for years. Gary paid medical bills, funded the education of his old acquaintances' children, and wrote checks to complete strangers who shared a sad story. He did it so quietly that even those closest to him were not always aware of the scale of his charity. People often mistook his silence for consent and his gentleness for a lack of will. His home was frequently filled with freeloaders enjoying his hospitality, while he himself sought solitude in the quiet of his own thoughts. Cooper was uncontrollable in his desire to be a good man to everyone, and the weight of that mission was often more than he could bear. The tragedy of Gary Cooper lay in the fact that his quiet decency left no room for defending his own interests. He carried the burdens of countless other lives on his shoulders, forgetting his own exhaustion and failing health. Even when he was mortally ill with cancer, he continued to smile and reassure those around him that everything was fine, simply to spare them worry. His death in 1961 shocked a nation that had seen him as a symbol of permanence. Cooper departed, leaving behind hundreds of rescued lives and paid bills, the full extent of which became known only later. He was a knight who fought evil not with a sword, but with endless patience and forgiveness, allowing the world to draw on his light until his very last breath.
Judy Garland. Judy Garland was not merely the greatest performer of her generation. She was the most luminous and at the same time the most tragic example of how Hollywood can turn boundless human kindness into a tool for the total destruction of a person. The world knew her as Dorothy from The Wizard of Oz, the girl searching for her way home. In reality, Judy was someone whose heart stood so wide open that anyone could step inside and feed on her light. Her kindness was startling, almost pathological, a painful need to make everyone around her happy. from studio tycoons to random fans. It was this holy inability to refuse that made her the easiest prey for emotional scavengers who drained her life for decades, exploiting her complete inability to hate or defend herself. On set, Judy's kindness became her personal hell. While MGM turned her existence into a relentless assembly line, pumping her full of pills to sleep and pills to stay awake, Judy herself remained astonishingly compassionate. Studio management, embodied by Louis B. Mayer, exploited this without shame. He knew Judy was pathologically afraid of disappointing people, and he manipulated that guilt, forcing a 16-year-old girl to work 18-hour days. She never complained because she saw how exhausted the extras and crew were and feared that her protest might cost them their jobs. Producers took advantage of her golden heart, pushing her to perform for soldiers, endure endless promotional tours, and star in films at the very edge of physical collapse. Her urge to give love was uncontrollable. If someone on the crew looked distressed, Judy could sacrifice her single hour of rest to comfort them, forgetting her own fainting spells and exhaustion. Off-screen, her generosity and softness turned her life into chaos. Husbands and managers exploited her kindness, seeing not a woman, but a cash cow with an extraordinary voice. Judy was ready to give her last dollar to anyone who told her a sad story. There were times when she literally removed expensive jewelry from her own body and handed it to near strangers just to see a smile appear on their faces. Her home was always filled with freeloaders living at her expense, while Judy herself was trapped in the grip of depression and addiction. She forgave infidelity, theft, and betrayal from those closest to her, believing that if she gave even more love, the world would eventually be kinder in return. But the world only demanded new portions of her talent and emotional strength, offering nothing back. The tragedy of Judy Garland was that she remained a child in a world of predators. Her kindness was a defense mechanism against cruelty. She tried to love her enemies into submission and instead bled herself dry. She was a wounded bird who kept singing the most beautiful songs, while those who called themselves her friends methodically clipped her wings. Hollywood used her light until only a shadow remained. And when her heart stopped at 47, the world suddenly realized it had lost someone who was simply too pure for this planet. Judy Garland is remembered as the girl who never found her way home, because she spent her entire life helping others find theirs.
Cary Grant was the embodiment of Hollywood elegance, witty, impeccably dressed, and impossibly handsome. For decades, the press cultivated a myth of his alleged stinginess. Tabloids delighted in stories claiming he charged guests for laundry or counted every last cent. But today, we uncover a truth far greater than that petty fiction. Cary Grant was a man of shockingly deep, almost fanatical kindness, which he carefully concealed from the gaze of the paparazzi. Having endured poverty and the trauma of a psychiatric hospital where his mother was confined during his childhood, Grant carried a lifelong, almost reverent sensitivity to the suffering of others. His decency and secrecy were exploited by everyone: former wives, casual acquaintances, and even major charitable organizations that grew accustomed to receiving checks with 5 zeros, provided his name never appeared anywhere. Grant's kindness on set revealed itself in his rare instinct to protect those who were weaker. Unlike many divas of his era, he never tried to steal the spotlight. His generosity was shamelessly used by young actresses and inexperienced directors. Cary spent hours of his personal time rehearsing with newcomers, effectively building their careers through the sheer weight of his authority.
Universal studio executives knew that Cary was a soft touch when it came to helping colleagues. They manipulated his sense of loyalty, persuading him to accept roles in questionable projects simply because the studio promised, in return, to give work to some forgotten actor from the past. Grant allowed his name to be used as leverage to save other people's livelihoods, often sacrificing his own creative potential in the process. He became a silent guarantor of stability for hundreds of families working behind the scenes, and Hollywood eagerly took advantage of this unspoken role of benefactor. Off-screen, his generosity took on almost biblical proportions. Cary Grant was a man incapable of turning away those who truly needed help. Hundreds of people benefited from his kindness. He anonymously donated vast sums to charities, supporting orphans and the homeless, never forgetting his half-starved childhood in Bristol. It is known that during the Second World War, he gave his entire fee from the Philadelphia story to the British Red Cross, an act the studio tried to conceal so as not to damage his image as a calculating rich man. Grant preferred that the world see him as a miser as long as no one interfered with his quiet acts of mercy. This secrecy, however, was exploited by manipulators around him. Knowing that Cary would never publicly defend his reputation, friends and relatives drained him financially for years, threatening scandals or simply feeding off his deeply ingrained sense of guilt. The tragedy of Cary Grant lay in his permanent loneliness behind the image of the perfect man. He was too kind to show the door to those who robbed him, and too proud to boast of his compassion. He lived his life creating comfort for others, often standing in the cold himself. Grant left behind not only great comedies, but thousands of invisible traces of his kindness, which began to surface only after his death. He proved that true goodness needs no applause, and that a gentleman's finest suit is a pure heart, capable of forgiving even those who shamelessly exploit its warmth. Cary Grant was an angel wearing an aristocrat's mask who allowed the world to believe he was a cynic so that he could save people without witnesses.
Audrey Hepburn. Audrey Hepburn became a global symbol of elfin beauty and aristocratic grace, yet behind her fragile silhouette lived a woman of such startling kindness that she seemed almost impossible within the cynical machinery of the entertainment industry. Having survived the horrors of Nazi occupation in the Netherlands, where she witnessed death and ate tulip bulbs to stay alive, Audrey lost forever the capacity for selfishness. Her kindness was not merely a personality trait, it was her religion, her form of protest against the cruelty of the world. Audrey Hepburn was Hollywood's saint, whose gentleness and inability to refuse were exploited by everyone, from producers who saw her discipline as a way to cut costs on set, to politicians and husbands who basked in the glow of her purity, while she herself slowly burned out, trying to save every hungry child on the planet. On set, Audrey's kindness was so flawless it unsettled those around her. She was the only star of her stature who was never late, never complained, and always apologized to the lighting crew if a scene failed to work on the first take. Studio executives exploited this mercilessly. Knowing that Audrey was pathologically polite, they pushed her into exhausting publicity campaigns and social appearances she deeply disliked. She believed it was her duty to smile at every fan and sign every autograph, even when she could barely stay on her feet. Producers understood that if they needed to persuade Hepburn to endure punishing shoots in extreme conditions, it was enough to say that the crew was counting on her. And Audrey worked herself to exhaustion, ignoring her fragile health so as not to let down those behind the camera. She allowed Hollywood to exploit her image of the perfect woman, seeing it as the price she had to pay for the right to help others. In her private life, her kindness and her need to give love often became a curse.
Husbands and close friends took advantage of her softness and her desire to create an ideal home at any cost. Audrey forgave betrayals and infidelities that would have shattered most women, simply to preserve peace and harmony around her. She was someone who gave everything and asked for nothing in return, and this holy naivety was frequently abused by those who sought in her not a person, but an immaculate backdrop for their own lives. Yet the greatest act of her kindness came when she nearly left cinema behind to become a UNICEF Goodwill Ambassador. Global organizations used her name and her compassion to draw attention to tragedies in Africa and Asia. Audrey did not merely pose for photographs with children. She lived in their tents, shared their meager food, and held the hands of those dying from hunger, giving them the last reserves of her emotional strength. The tragedy of Audrey Hepburn was that she quite literally exhausted her life force for the sake of others. In her final years, as illness was already undermining her strength, she continued to fly into dangerous conflict zones, believing that her presence might save at least one life. Her mercy was uncontrollable. Doctors begged her to rest, but Audrey answered that children could not wait. Her kindness was both her fuel and her fire. She died in 1993, leaving behind a world made slightly warmer by her presence, yet still unable to protect people like her. Audrey Hepburn proved that true beauty is not appearance, but the ability to feel another person's pain more deeply than one's own. She was an angel who allowed the world to draw on her light until the very end, until only an eternal luminous memory remained.
Our series, Shockingly Kind, has come to its end. We have seen 10 lives that proved one simple truth: even in the very heart of cynical Hollywood, flowers of astonishing purity could bloom. We learned about people whose decency, generosity, and gentleness were stronger than millions of dollars and ironclad contracts. But we also faced a bitter reality. In a world of predators, kindness often comes at a terrible price. Boris Karloff gave up his health, Marilyn Monroe her fragile psyche, and Audrey Hepburn the last reserves of her life. The Golden Age left us not only great films, but also lessons in true humanity, taught by these actors beyond the frame. They were not saints in the religious sense, but they were saints in their devotion to people. Remember this: when you see them on screen, you are not just watching performances, you are seeing reflections of souls that knew how to love the world more than themselves. And perhaps it is their light that still makes classical cinema shine through the decades.